Hello, everyone. This is Michael Moore, and this is Rumble. We've had quite an interesting 5 or 6 hours here as I'm recording this at around 1 in the morning, the night of and after the Iowa caucus. And I think a lot of people are staying up late, trying to figure out if the Democrats will get it together and announce the results, and if not, what the plan is going to be. So we shall see. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and publish this podcast that I had planned for today. And if need be, I will record an emergency podcast system version of Rumble, either sometime during the night or in the morning, as soon as we learn more about what has happened in Iowa. And I'm just going to leave it at that. I have my own thoughts about this. I'm sure you do too. Once again, we have more proof that our broken electoral system has to change. There's absolutely no doubt about this. So, before we get started too, let me just thank our underwriters for today. We've got two underwriters. Oh, my God, no, we've got three. We've got three underwriters today. See, this is what happens. We hit our 3 millionth download since we started 6 weeks ago over the weekend. And more people are wanting to help support this podcast and what we're saying and getting the word out to more and more people. So thank you for that. And I would like to do that right now in person. I'd first like to thank our main underwriter today, which is Nat Geo, National Geographic, and their incredible documentary that has been nominated for the Academy Awards, which are this coming Sunday. The name of the film, the documentary, is called The Cave, and it is powerful, and you don't want to miss it. Nat Geo is the producer of it, and I thank both the filmmakers of this film and Nat Geo for underwriting today's show and for producing such a powerful film set in the midst of the current civil war in Syria. And it's already won many awards, and Film Critics Awards, DGA, Directors Guild Awards. It's certainly one of the most lauded films of the year, and one of the most powerful ones. I really hope you all get a chance to see it. So thank you, Nat Geo, for underwriting today's episode of Rumble. I also want to thank the good people at MTV, a new underwriter for Rumble. Kind of cool. MTV Films also is a nominee this year for the Oscars. The great Sheila Nevins, who all of us documentary filmmakers have known forever. She was in charge of all the documentaries at HBO for years, all the great HBO documentaries. Many of them have won Oscars before. I think she had retired and then came out of retirement to go over to MTV Films and sort of run things there. And in her first year there, comes up with another Academy Award nomination for this powerful film called St. Louis Superman. It's a film about an individual who runs for and gets elected to the Missouri State House, but he's from Ferguson, Missouri. And if you remember, Ferguson was the place where the police officer shot to death an unarmed teenager by the name of Mike Brown. And of course, what resulted from that were huge protests, curfews, and all sorts of police response in terms of attacking the citizens of the community. It was just brutal. It was awful. This was just a few years ago. I'm sure most of you remember it. And now this documentary short has been nominated for the Oscars this Sunday. It's called St. Louis Superman. I thank them. I thank the filmmakers. I thank Sheila Nevins, and I thank MTV for being a new underwriter of my podcast and giving me voice to do what I do. greatly appreciative of that. And then finally, our first ever underwriter who signed on, Anchor Podcast, their platform. They are the free podcast people. Anybody who wants to start their own podcast, you go to their site, their app, or their site is anchor.fm, and you can learn all right there how you too can have a podcast, and they will get it on Apple and Spotify and every place for you. And so they've been helpful to me, and they will help you. Thank you very much, Anchor Podcasts. Your platform and your work to democratize audio is appreciated by all of us. So I sat down with the great Naomi Klein last week. We were both in Iowa campaigning for Bernie, and our paths crossed, which was a very wonderful thing. And she is an important person to all of us. If you haven't heard of her, check her out online. Her current book is called On Fire. So let's give a listen now to what we recorded just a few days ago in the great state of Iowa. This is Rumble, and this is Michael Moore. Welcome to my podcast. We are still on the road here in Iowa. It's been an amazing week. And today I'm spending all of my day with one of my heroes. You don't mind me calling you a great thinker, do you? Is that because the reason I don't like that in a way is because you're also one of the great doers. And we have a lot of great thinkers, and we have a lot of great activists, and you have married the two for many, many years. I am, of course, talking to and about Naomi Klein, the great Naomi Klein, author, activist, filmmaker, so many things. And I think I probably first learned of you with your book, No Logo. And since then, she's written The Shock Doctrine and has a book out over the last few months called On Fire. First of all, thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Michael. I'm thrilled to be with you.
You grew up in Canada, if I'm correct. Was it Vancouver or Toronto?
It was actually Montreal.
It was Montreal.
I was born in Montreal. I went to Toronto for university, and then my whole family, my parents moved to British Columbia.
Right.
So I'm connected to those three places.
Right.
Yeah.
Your writings and your work over the year inspired many things, many actions. You are, I would say, one of the godmothers of Occupy Wall Street. I mean, this is a lot of the thinking around that came out of you and others. But you have not been afraid to deal and grapple with things that oftentimes, we'll say, liberals are nervous about saying the word capitalism, for instance. How did you get to be who you are, and how much of that is because you got to grow up in Canada?
I don't know if there's a simple answer to that question.
There probably isn't, but there's a worldview that develops somewhere.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And I should say that I don't think I was writing as frontally about capitalism all of this time. When I wrote No Logo, I was writing about corporate power and corporate rule, but maybe I was a little shy to actually say, this is a system that has entered into this predatory phase, but it's built into the DNA of the system, and it's something I've learned as I went along. I was a child of the '80s, and I became an adult in the '90s, and it was the peak era of triumphant market fundamentalism, and I was always on the left. As a student activist, I was very involved in women's issues, and I was the first issues I wrote about had to do with sexual violence on campus, But I do think that growing up in Canada shaped my worldview. I live in the States now. I have dual citizenship. I just say this, to make it clear that I don't represent foreign interference in the American election, because we are here in Iowa campaigning for Bernie. But I'm legit. I live in the States and I'm allowed to vote and all that. But the reason why I'm American is because my parents are American. My grandparents were American. My parents moved to Canada in the late 60s because my father was a war resistor, didn't want to go to Vietnam. And then we ended up staying in Canada. We went back to the States for a little bit.
But when he and your mom went to Canada as a war resistor, that meant that at that time it was probably hard for him to come back and visit family or whatever in the States. I mean, maybe for younger people to understand this.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was only my nuclear family, my parents, my brother, and I who lived in Canada. Everybody else was in the United States, including my half sister who was in California, and the rest of our whole extended family was across the border. And I remember growing up that borders were always stressful. And we did cross the border, but it was always sort of stressful. My parents still had their American passports. They were worried that things would come up on a search, but at that point, there wasn't the same kind of computerization. Later, there was the Carter pardon that made it less stressful to cross the border. But my parents actually did move back when I was very young in the 70s, and actually decided that they wanted to return to Canada, not as war resistors, but because by choice, because my father worked in healthcare. My father's a family doctor, and these were the years that Medicare was becoming a national program. It had been a provincial program, and it was really getting rolled out nationally. And he wanted to be part of a healthcare system that was truly universal, and he wanted to be part of building that. And he had been very upset about his experience working in the U.S. healthcare system. And so, I sometimes say we left because of the war, but we stayed for the universal public health care.
Right. So basically, he was refusing.
And I should apologize to you because I feel like there is, I don't know how closely you read On Fire or On Fire emoji, as you mentioned. And that was my idea. And I did have to fight to have an emoji. Right. I'm like, we are in a post-literate world. But some of my publishers had this weird idea that words still matter. We should still use them. But luckily, my American publisher was just like, let's just go with the emoji. And
I love that.
I like it too.
But just before we leave your parents for a second.
But I wanted to say I should apologize to you because I have an essay in that book where I talk about growing up as a child of war resistors, and that their vision of Canada was this super idealized vision of Canada as Americans that I said is a little bit like growing up inside a Michael Moore movie where in Canada no one locks their doors and everything's perfect. And in Canada we always complained about this. We're like, we have problems, Michael Moore.
I hear this.
We have colonial violence and we have racism and we suck as well on lots of other levels.
I hear this all the time from Canadians. They're just it's so rough up here, and we do. Well, of course, because wherever you live, I mean, you can go to France and Sweden and hear them complain about their healthcare system because every system has problems. Every country has problems. It's about power. Those who have power are usually the people with the money, and that's true in Canada. Hello, Conrad Black. I mean, this is like, but I think because as Americans, the first time you go to Canada, you're just stunned by so many things that probably as Canadians just take for granted because it's just their daily life.
Well, and I mean, now I'm in the States and, I have a 7-year-old and, he came home from school last year, first grade, a little edgy and took some sort of probing, but it turned out that they had one of these drills where it was
the
essentially
active shooter drill.
And he's had 4 of them in his little life now, and that's when I tell my Canadian friends that they can't believe it. They can't believe it. So there are real differences, and we do need to talk about those differences without idealizing it. But I do, I always had the sense as somebody who grew up in Canada but was very much engaged in political debates in the United States, that there was something about these big political and economic victories that my parents' generation had won, right? Like universal public health care, like the CBC, having a public broadcaster that is fully funded and is the main that the system of information that holds the country together, that creates a common conversation across a vast land, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the National Film Board of Canada, where my mother worked, which is a government funded film agency. And my mother was part of a little group of feminist troublemakers who had the first women's film studio, and they were making films as I was growing up that were very much counterculture films. That's unheard of in this country, right? And so I remember when Conrad Black.
You should explain who he is.
It's just
Oh wow, that
he just hates me so much. Like he writes these like 4,000 word columns just attacking me. So like anything I say is just gonna like give him an excuse to just be.
Oh, you should wear that
spew
as a badge of
vile
honor.
all over me.
I know, but
Conrad Black doesn't matter.
Right.
He is a criminal, convicted criminal who's got released and used to own a newspaper chain and
the Murdoch of Canada.
Yeah,
is that safe to say? Sort of.
Yeah, it is safe to say. And when he launched this new national newspaper, the National Post in Canada, he said that the goal was I forget the exact words, but it was something like Canadians had to stop deriving their identities from these bureaucracies, right? And that he was setting out to delegitimize the healthcare system, the CBC, these public institutions that he saw as he saw it as so lowly that people identified like what it means to be Canadian with Medicare, which Canadians will tell you what again and again, like being Canadian is part of it is having universal public health care. And that's why candidates on the right and the left always run promising to protect universal public health care. Doesn't matter how right-wing they are. And we've had some very right-wing prime ministers. You cannot touch it now that we have it because it is so beloved. Mm-hmm. And what was interesting about the way Conrad Black phrased that is it just showed how little he understands about the relationship between these programs that he dismisses as bureaucracies and the values of a country, right? Like, saying everybody has the right to health care and the same kind of health care regardless of whether you're rich or poor, whether you live in a remote community or not. And once again, it isn't what it should be, and particularly for Indigenous people.
Right.
And they're attacking it because they can't attack it frontally. They chip away at it, right?
Right.
But it is an expression of our values, right? That we say everybody we value everyone's life, and it is about the kind of people we want to be. It expresses something really deep about us that we are never going to say that because you lack money, your life isn't of value.
Right.
And so I think the Canada question is, I learned that that when you make these big decisions, it's not about a bureaucracy. It's not about government. It's about values, and it changes the values of a country. It changes who people are, and it changes people's horizons, right? Like, I'm so struck now, once again, being in the States and teaching students with these huge debt loads. I mean, we have student debt in Canada, but it is nothing like here in the United States.
What is it like?
Well, I mean, first of all, we don't have private universities. So we only have public universities.
And why don't you have private universities?
Because David Frum just goes to Harvard.
Right. Oh, boy.
Because they don't want Canadian Harvard. They actually want Harvard for their kids.
No, but I don't know if it's the same reason, but when I was in Finland working on one of my films, I met with the Secretary of Education in their cabinet, and she said it's essentially illegal to have a private school in Finland. There are exemptions for religion and things like that, but I said, well, why? I mean, so you don't have a Harvard of Finland? And she said, oh yes, no, we have 19 Harvards. Every university, which is public, has to reach the same standard, or at least attempt to, whether you live up in Lapland or you live here in Helsinki, and they are very serious about this, and because they don't want nobody should have a leg up because they have money to go to a better school. I don't know if that's the same reason in Canada, but it was. She also said that making the rich and the children of the rich go to the same schools as everybody else with the same standards, the same quality, as as much as same can be in any human organization. But they believe that if these wealthy kids have to sit next to and live and work with and get along with the other, that maybe they won't grow up as adults to be so vicious and cruel, simply because they may end up with more money because they are children of the rich. But maybe they'll have a little touch of empathy.
I wonder if that's explicit in the thinking in Canada. I think when it comes to post-secondary education and it comes to the healthcare system, there's definitely an explicit idea that if there's a two-tiered system, then the wealthy will just put their kids in the private system and let the public system rot. And so the idea of that, well, we need, and they use all this language, we need healthcare choice. Yes, we can have Medicare, but let us have our fancy private, hospitals. And everybody knows that if that's the case, that the public hospitals will just be.
So you don't have fancy private hospitals either?
No, I mean, whatever hospital you go to in Canada, you pay through Medicare. I mean, some of them are
through your taxes.
You have your Medicare card.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is very personal to me because unfortunately my family's been through some really catastrophic illnesses, and my mother had a devastating stroke when she was 46. I was 17, and she had 2 strokes. It knocked out everything except including her breathing. She could blink. That's all the movement she had. It turned out she had a brain tumor that had bled twice, and she needed a life-saving operation that wasn't available. She needed to be helivac'd. She was in hospital and rehabilitation for 2 years, and in the end has gotten back enough of movement to be able to get around in a scooter, and she's made a remarkable recovery. But this was a truly, truly catastrophic illness that required, every benefit that our system was able to afford. She was in the neurological ICU for months.
And it didn't bankrupt your family.
We left with, I think it was a $24 bill for cable in the hospital, in one of the hospital rooms. That's it. After no paperwork and no and when a family goes through something like that, it takes everything that a family has to survive it. And when I think about having that experience compounded with, and you're fighting, you're advocating, and we were so privileged to have a doctor in the family who was able to advocate for her, and at many different turns that advocacy probably saved her life. So it's not like it was easy.
Right.
But what we didn't have to do was fight with insurance companies. We didn't have to argue with anybody about what was covered and what wasn't covered. We didn't, just since I moved to the States, I mean, the difference for me, and I've only been living here for 1.5 years. I mean, just the amount of paperwork that we get just for basic, checkups is vastly more than my family dealt with for a truly catastrophic illness.
Okay, but you did point out there's no free cable in a Canadian hospital. So there are some drawbacks. Now I'm trying to not be so myopic about Canada, and just sort of, understand that it's more different.
Well, the last time my mom was in hospital, she broke her hip, and she confessed to me that she had become addicted to say yes to the dress.
Yes, right.
So she canceled her cable voluntarily because of that.
Yeah, say yes to the dress. This is the wedding dress show on one of the cable channels where you go and you try on dresses. So we're still trying to figure out what's so... and listen, I know, like I said, Canada has its problems, but I often say to my fellow Americans... first of all, don't go up to Canada and break into their homes just because I told you their doors were unlocked. That's a very true scene in the film. That's right there in downtown Toronto. and it's 7:30 at night. And we did the average. I filmed a whole bunch of them, and 67% of the doors.
This is Bowling for Columbine.
This is Bowling for Columbine. 67% of the doors. I got to tell you something. I had this idea to put that scene in the film like 3 years before I did it, and all the time we're making Bowling for Columbine. Every time we're in Canada filming, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it, and I can't do it. I'm in America. The idea of opening somebody's door and just walking in this country and coming out alive, it's a 50-50 situation there. And even there in Toronto, I'm like, oh man, they have guns here. It's a big nation of hunters.
I remember that, and we have, there's guns in Canada too.
Yes, there are many guns,
but
hunting guns mostly.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, to be honest with you, like the event that turned me into an activist was when I was in first year university in 1989, and a gunman went into University of Montreal and killed 14 women because he said they were fucking feminists. So but that was, and there have been mass shooting events in Canada and stabbing events, and we had a horrific mass killing at a mosque in Quebec City after Trump was elected. But I remember, when people would talk about Bowling for Columbine, and they would say, I can't believe Michael Moore said that we don't lock our doors. We lock our doors. And then somebody would point out, but he meant like when you're home, you don't lock your doors.
Right. Yeah.
And they're like, oh yeah, we never lock our doors when we're home. I mean, we lock our doors when we're out and when we're going to sleep.
Right. But especially in urban areas in the United States, but also suburban areas, you're automatically trained to, when you come home and you shut the door and it's a night, evening, you lock the door. I mean, there's nothing, you don't think that's weird in the U.S., but
and it depends on it certainly depends on the neighborhood in Canada for sure. But look.
Yeah, but even
laws change cultures, right? Like it's not like we love laws. It's not that we love bureaucracy.
I agree.
That these actually change the culture, how we relate to each other, the kinds of dreams we're allowed to have. If you have debt, you're going to be graduating with $100,000 in debt, that will shape what you imagine for yourself in your life, right?
Right. In the U.S., when you graduate with that $100,000.
Yeah. If your health care is attached to you as a person as opposed to your job, that change that transforms your horizons. It's the difference, if you're a woman, between whether you can stay at a job where you're being sexually harassed or not. I mean, it affects absolutely everything. But most of all, I think it's an expression of just whether or not we're willing to just let people die because they don't have money. And that is so fundamental. And to me, as you know, like I've been obsessed with the climate crisis now for more than a decade, and came to it later than I should have. But I feel like this fundamental question, I always think about that moment in that it was in a Republican debate, and you'll remember this better than me, because I think it wasn't 2016. I think it was 2012, that election cycle, when there was a question, what would you do? And it was to all the Republicans who were running for president. What would you do if somebody came to an emergency room and they didn't have insurance? And then somebody in the audience shouted, let them die.
Mm-hmm, that's correct.
And then everybody cheered.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
I think about that moment all the time, because if you are willing to say, let them die because they didn't have health insurance, and tell yourself a story that rationalizes that, about how that's some sort of character flaw of theirs, and that you have that right to sit in judgment and say, let them die, then you, when huge swaths of this planet start to become uninhabitable, as is already starting to happen, and people start getting onto leaky boats, and start trekking through continents to try to get to safety, if you have already changed your brain enough to be able to say, let that individual die who showed up at the emergency room because they didn't have health insurance, then you will be able to escalate that mentality to say, let them all die, because for whatever reason their countries weren't able to adapt to the climate crisis and so on. And that is what is happening on our borders. This is what I call climate barbarism. And this is like we need to when we talk about the climate crisis, it is not just about building seawalls and lowering emissions. It is a fundamental question about what kind of human beings we are going to be in a rocky future that we have locked in. And that's why a Green New Deal, which links getting our emissions down as quickly as is technologically possible, with Medicare for all, with housing for all, with universal childcare, what that's going to allow us to do is it's the shift in values that is going to allow us to navigate this rocky future without becoming monsters. And the monsterizing has begun.
Yeah. This is the moment in the podcast now where I'm going to go dark.
Okay.
And I'm usually very optimistic. Yeah. But you just said a number of very profound things. And you're right. There's nothing special about the biology or the DNA of a Canadian. You've got the same 23 chromosomes in each one of your cells that I do, and every American has, and every Canadian has, and every Bangladeshi has, everybody on the planet. And that's why it isn't policy alone. But how do you get to the point of supporting, to believing, as you rightly said, that Canadians believe that if you get sick, you should be able to be healed and not lose your home. And that it's just a fundamental thing. It's like you said, it's not a liberal thing. It's not a conservative thing. It's a human thing. And you have to, this country, which you are also a citizen of, I'm sorry, that moment in that 2012 debate where the person in the Republican audience shouted out, "Let them die," and the cheer, that is us. And that's certainly almost half the country would cheer that. Not all, not the majority. I don't believe that. But I believe then there's enough in the other half that say, you know what? I live in Des Moines. I'm in the middle of the country. I'm not going to drown. The rising ocean doesn't affect me. Why should I care, really? I mean, I do care, but and I think that our inability to deal with this climate emergency, when I use the word emergency instead of climate change, people are like, what do you mean by emergency? I mean, yes, there's a problem. They believe that there is climate change. They don't deny it, but they don't have a sense that we have to really do anything about it. And if it doesn't affect me, and I got to say, this is the big difference I see between, say, Canadians, not to put them all in the same room, and Americans. And it's so odd, too, because even though, English is the official language of the United States, the first American English word officially was the word we. It was the first word we wrote down, we the people. And my whole life, I've just wondered what happened to that word where I, first of all, and see myself as part of the we. And I think that you, the part of you that's Canadian and other Canadians, organize yourselves around the principle of we. And we, Americans, organize ourselves around the principle of me. Me. How does this affect me? My concern is myself and my family. That's what I'm going to take care of. And if I get sick, I'll take care of me. You get sick, you take care of you. You being sick is not my problem. Australia on fire, I'm sad. I'm sorry to see that. Not my problem.
Mm-hmm. But this relates to how the systems that we live within, right, light up different parts of ourselves, because we all have the me, and we all have the we, and we all have the capacity for incredible generosity and compassion. And we all have the capacity to...
We have the capacity, but as Americans...
Well, look, you mentioned Iowa and the climate crisis. Iowans have dealt with massive flooding. And they come out and help their neighbors in unbelievable ways. They don't say, "Oh, my house is fine. You can deal with your house." They fill bales and they I mean, they do amazing things for each other, and they cook meals, and they, and Paradise, California. I mean, think about what happened there. In the parking lot of Walmart, you have basically an anti-Walmart emerge, where there's thousands of people who come together to give each other hot food and clothing and so on. And so we all have it in us, including Americans. But,
yes, but we
have systems that suppress it in this country, and
encourage the other kind of behavior.
Encourage
We're very good at charity.
Hierarchy.
We like charity, and we will. If your house burns down, we will help you. We absolutely. My neighbor, the person down the street, whatever. The basketball team doesn't have uniforms because of the fire. We'll all chip in and buy I mean, we're really good at that, and we saw ourselves behave that way after 9/11. But we are not wired to really to think beyond pretty much our the people that we encounter in our daily lives that are nearby to us.
And we also have systems, political, economic, and media systems that discourage that solidarity, that says after 9/11, actually the best thing you can do is go shopping, like the ultimate individualist thing you can do.
Right.
Or after the Paradise Fire, and these amazing expressions of solidarity, people opening their homes to strangers and saying, I have a spare bedroom. You have all this real estate speculation. You have all this profiteering. Rents are going up. Utilities are going up. People are flipping houses, and everybody is stressed out. And then there's this hierarchy of like, wait a minute, you're not homeless because of the fire. You were already homeless before the fire, and you're just like a freeloading homeless person. And let's set up this hierarchy of deserving and undeserving poor. And we've got, and then you can see how this gets weaponized against migrants. Like, well, we've got enough of our problems.
Right.
We're already seeing this in Australia after the fires.
Right.
Of like, okay, well, we have all this internal displacement. We can't deal with other migrants, right? So I think the question we need to ask ourselves, and this is where it's connected deeply to, I think why we're both here giving everything, that we have to support the Sanders campaign, is that fundamentally it is about a shift in values from that me to that we to that us. So it is about all these policies, but what connects all the policies is trying to light up the we part of ourselves. And, when you talk about that, Americans are wired for me, my healthcare system, I always felt, I feel like you're too hard on yourselves as Americans about this, because my perspective growing up in Canada was always that, if you can't take healthcare for granted, the most basic thing in your family, if you can't take it for granted that your kids are going to be taken care of when they're sick, and you can't take it for granted that you'll be able to give them a good education, if you don't live in a society that is taking care of the basics, right? And in Canada, we should take care of more basics. We don't take care of housing enough as a basic. We have a homelessness crisis. But once the basics are taken care of, you have the bandwidth to think about we. But when people are, in the United States where you can't take that for granted, I think a lot of people are making decisions that are actually not about me. They're about their kids. They manifest as selfish decisions, or they look like selfish decisions. I have to take this job that, is incredibly unethical or whatever it is. But it's because they're in a state of acute precarity. I mean, when you live in a society that is saying, take nothing for granted, it's everybody on their own, it is lighting up that
right.
part. So once you put in a floor and say the basics are going to be taken care of, that makes a sense of we are in this together possible. That if everybody is on their own in a structure being on their own,
yes.
that it's impossible.
And I couldn't agree more in terms of too with that, and why we're both out here helping Bernie, is because that floor that he would create, he and the Democratic Senate that is going to get elected this fall. When you see, I think Americans, my unfortunate opinion of my fellow people here is, I know that they're not born that way. I know they're not born to be selfish in that sense. It's not being selfish. They're just struggling because there's a boot on their neck, and it's called student debt. It's called, oh, for God's sake, don't get sick. We'll never be able to afford this, or we're going to have to fight the insurance company because they're never going to pay for this this hospital stay, that constant fear that you live with, it's a form of terror. I mean, I think it's a form of, the real terrorism to me is that sense that, oh, now I'm in debt till I'm 45 years old to pay off these student loans. I'm not going to be able to work the jobs that I want to work. I'm going to have to take jobs that I hate. And I hate myself for working these jobs. And I go home and I'm miserable. And yeah, and you, after a few years of that, you sit around and you go, fuck everybody else. I'm going to start thinking about me because, let's circle the wagons. That circle the wagons image that began with our expansion westward, I think is very strong here. And if we succeed in this election year, I believe that within years, not too far in the distant future, when you don't have student debt, when you don't ever have to worry about if you get sick, where you can attend a political event and because there's a daycare system that you can afford. How many people can't get involved politically because who's going to watch the kids? And I can't afford to pay what you'd have to pay. How many people don't get involved because they're working two jobs? They're all just to make ends meet. It's so difficult. And they're like, I'm sorry. I mean, I do care about politics or what's going on, but man, my life is just, and they're ratcheted. And the screw keeps turning and turning and turning until the screw is stripped.
And I think that this is, it is about me, but it's also about like us and them, right? Because I think that in that environment, and then when you layer the climate crisis on top, and it is layered on top, like whether or not people are conscious of it or not, we all know that our home is in crisis. On some level, we know in our DNA that our home, that the natural systems on which life depends are unraveling. It's impossible not to know it. And that doesn't necessarily serve as a kind of a wake-up call, like, hey, let's all, join the Paris Accord and keep to our emission reduction targets. In the context of fear and terror that you're describing, it makes people putty in the hands of a Trump. And this isn't just happening in the United States, where people are just, we are 40 years into the neoliberal project, and even the countries that had universal programs, they have been eroded and eroded and eroded, and people are getting gigs instead of jobs, and they have no idea whether their industries are going to exist in a few years. And on top of that, they don't know whether the planet itself is safe. And so when a strongman figure comes along and says, you are the in-group and these are out-groups within our country and across the borders, and yes, things are tough, but we are going to protect you. You will be on the inside, and you'll get a sort of a perverse and even a sadistic joy in the fact that as bad as things are, they're better for you than they are for that guy over there. Right. And we are in a moment of sadism. It isn't, it isn't just inequality. Sadistic. There is a sadism to it. That's right.
And a joy, a sadism with joy that the wealthy somehow, they're so giddy with how much they own now, with how much they have. And the way that they look at everybody else who's fighting for the crumbs, it really is, some sick version of the Hunger Games. I mean, Hunger Games is already a sick version of a dystopian society that's not really that far into the future, in the sense that, yeah, sorry, sucker. It's just the way it works. It's survival of the fittest, and we're the fittest. We have the money, and good luck.
Well, I think they may be overplaying their hands.
Absolutely. Oh, no. This is here's the good news. Because they have behaved this way, because they've made life so difficult for people struggling to live from week to week, paycheck to paycheck. That statistic I'm sure you saw, where the average American doesn't have $500 on hand if there was a car that broke down or their loved one passed away. They can't fly across the country to the funeral. These, really kind of basic things. And I think all of that is meant to crush the spirit, because the greatest fear I'm sure the wealthy have is that if the spirit rose, if the spirit got up, if what they're so stunned this week, you must follow this on the news, the pundits and everything, with how Bernie is now doing so well and how he's surging, and they're all wandering around Iowa like, how did this happen? What's going on here? The other candidates are like, wait a minute, and they don't get it. But if you come just a little bit outside your bubble and go around this state, go around practically any state, you can see that the people have had it. And, Bernie Sanders is giving them this way out. And I think it's possible that there's going to be a huge surprise this year. A surprise not to you or I maybe, or the people listening to this, but,
I'm surprised as hell, Michael.
You are.
I can't believe what we are living. I can't believe, I feel, honestly, as somebody who spends their time looking at really terrifying climate news, and honestly, I feel a lot of the time, I feel so sad that we have to be alive at this moment where we are watching the beauty of our world destroyed. And we have to think about, a future for our kids that is unthinkable. My son is such a nature kid. He is not so interested in humans. He loves whales and dolphins and, otters, and he was born, by the Pacific Ocean, and that is his home. And the idea that he has to watch, that he has to watch this disappear, that I have to tell him, that one day that the salmon aren't coming back, and all of these whole entire ecosystems that rely on it, and indigenous ways of life. And I feel like some people say, we're lucky we're alive at this moment where we have the power to change things. And I've never felt that. I have felt like, I don't want to watch this. There's so much grief in it.
Right.
And I don't want to keep watching, islands destroyed by hurricanes and incredible cities flooded, and and we are out of time. And
I think we were out of time some time ago. This is okay. I might be more depressed than you.
Well, let me just finish this thought. Let me just finish this thought. But what I never truly imagined is that in the nick of time, and not to say that we can stop a lot of loss. We've locked in a lot of it, right? But we do have enough time to prevent truly catastrophic unraveling if we actually get our emissions down to zero, which I'm not saying there's any guarantee that we would do. But what we have now for the first time is we have a candidate who is talking about solutions to this crisis on the scale of the crisis.
Right.
The trillions of dollars that Bernie is talking about marshaling, and not just in the United States, but internationally, to actually get the whole world at the table once again and really moving this quickly. This has never happened. But what has also never happened is a proud democratic socialist connected to social movements. We have known Bernie forever. Bernie's the guy who speaks at our anti-war protests and our climate marches, and he's was the one politician we could depend on, right? He's a movement connected politician who's running a campaign like a movement. That's not FDR. That is different. That's more like Eugene Debs. There has never been a movement candidate in the history of this country as close to the White House as Bernie Sanders.
Right.
And it is my incredible honor and privilege, and I think we all have to feel this, to be alive to see that, to see us surge at the last possible moment. Michael, you are a filmmaker. The drama of this, it's crazy that we are in a moment of such profound peril, but also this promise. These polls are mind-blowing.
Yeah, they are.
And not to say Bernie's going to fix everything with a magic wand, but we actually have a fighting chance to stop the worst impacts of the climate crisis and achieve the shift in values that will allow us to be kind to each other and care for each other and hold on to our humanity as this hits. And when I'm up there, I feel my grandfather with me, who died 22 years ago, who was blacklisted, fired for organizing a union, in the 1940s, and then blacklisted and was never able to work in his chosen profession again. He never would have believed this. My family had to leave this country because they opposed the Vietnam War. And they still don't believe this, my parents, that this could happen. So we have our ancestors with us.
Right.
This is history that we're living.
No, that part I feel, being here in Iowa this last week, it is happening. It really is happening. And I want people listening to this to have a real sense that this isn't just to hear ourselves talk anymore, or to, let's all get together and we're, carrying our banner, marching down the street. This, when he says that when he enters the Oval Office, he's taking all of us in there with him, he actually really means that he will govern as the President of the United States and the leader of a movement that is going to go after these things that are killing us. And especially this issue of what we've done to the planet. And, but, I have this, I don't think a day goes by where I don't tear up just watching the news or reading the news or whatever. And I just think, don't sink into your despair about this. This is, but I'm one. You have to convince me, because I'm one of these people that just believe that maybe it is too late. Too late in the sense that we have destroyed certain things that we're not going to get back.
No, I mean we've lost. We've lost. We have the space for humanity to live on this planet is contracting. Right? This is why it's connected with this rise of xenophobia and supremacist logics around the world. We have lost natural wonders. We've basically lost the Great Barrier Reef. We are losing the Amazon rainforest. We are, Iceland, they're having funerals for glaciers. I mean, this is stuff that we don't get back. So I'm not here to say, this is that the impossible is possible, that this is a rosy picture. I believe that it is possible to protect a space for humanity where we can live well if we live very differently and if we treat each other very, very differently. And this is a lifeline. And what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us in October 2018 is that we need to keep temperatures warming below warming levels of 1.5 degrees Celsius. They said that we can do this if we cut emissions in half globally by 2020. That means that a rich country like the United States, which has been polluting for longer and more than any country on the planet, has to move faster. Bernie's the one who gets this. He gets that because of how much pollution this country has put out, that the way to galvanize the rest of the world is to do more faster and to put some real money on the table. We haven't seen that kind of truly internationalist leadership from a U.S. government. People say, Obama got it on climate change. Please. I was at the UN summits when Obama would come in, with his negotiators, dashing the hopes of small island nations, and Africans would be marching out of sessions calling it genocide because the temperature levels that the U.S. were calling for would mean that Africa would burn. So, we've never tried this before. The U.S. has never led before. The Obama administration did great PR and said, we got the Paris Accord. The Paris Accord was non-binding. That's why, and if you added up what all of the governments, including the U.S., brought to the table, it would have led to warming of about 4 degrees or more, right? So it didn't matter that they said we have to keep temperatures below 1.5. They weren't willing to do it. They made that very, very clear. So, what Bernie is bringing to the table, it has never been seen before. We have to count on other people on this planet having a survival instinct and being inspired and pushing their governments. which is what they're doing in Australia right now, because this isn't the only government that's crazy. I mean, look at the Australian government. This Scott Morrison, his country is on fire, and he still wants to dig the world's biggest coal mine. I mean, there is a madness that has gripped. So the question is are people going to wake up? And that is what this campaign represents, an awakening. And I mean, coming back to what I was saying before about the history, I mean, I think part of what is happening here, and I could be wrong, and I'd really love to hear your perspective on it, but like, I feel like, there's so many ways in which this country denies its history, right? It denies the history of genocide against indigenous people, doesn't want to talk about slavery. It's constantly about, the reboot. Let's start over. It's the fresh start country, But one of the things I think we talk about least is the war on the left in this country, and the fact that there's been a very, very dirty war waged on socialists in this country, black socialists, democratic socialists, the trade unionists. It's been bloody. It's been bloodiest for black workers, but it's been bloody for white workers too. And the suppression of that history worked for a really long time. But that's what I feel is lifting. Like, I mean, maybe I'm projecting, but I feel like I feel like something is happening where the deep roots of revolutionary movements in this country are reawakening. And that's what I feel like this campaign at its best should represent. And this is why, honestly, I'm sad about my friends who aren't part of it yet, because it's not perfect, and there are reasons to not join. And I've heard those reasons.
What are they?
I think there are people who still feel that Bernie isn't centering racial justice enough, isn't centering women's issues enough. And I mean, I don't want to debate those points, because I think, I think there are valid criticisms. And I also think that it's also the result of unfair smears. I think people are remembering the 2016 campaign, and they aren't looking at the ways in which the campaign has changed. The reason why I think we need to understand how historic this is I don't want people to sit this out who have been fighting their whole lives, and their parents and generations before them have been fighting for real deep change in this country.
Right.
Because it's a privilege to be part of this. I don't feel lucky about, like I said, I don't feel lucky about a lot of things about being alive right now in this moment in history. I don't like watching the world burn. I don't like watching Donald Trump and this moral degeneration. But I never thought I would see people's courage rise like this, and people just drop the shame about actually being on the left and actually being part of a revolutionary movement and feel pride in that.
You thank young people for that, because you look at the polls, people under the age of 40 don't believe capitalism is the system. Certainly the form of capitalism that we live under now is not the system that is the correct system, and that they don't see anything wrong with the idea of socialism. They understand what it means in terms of the fairness of it, of how we divide things up and how we treat each other and all that. It's not surprising to me that a younger generation, that my generation has raised. One of the good things you could say about boomers, we may not be leaving the world in the shape that we thought we'd be leaving it in as we move on, but we certainly raised some good kids who aren't haters, who care about this planet, and who understand that the economic system that we have is unjust and it's unfair and it's not democratic. So I'm optimistic about that piece of it. But I have the same friends who are liberals and who when I start talking about Bernie, they're like, well, he's saying all this. He can't afford all this stuff. We're not going to be able to do all this. We can't. So negative about we can't do this. We can't make this happen. We can't. And I said, why are you taking that approach to when actually, yes, we can do all these. What happened to your Obama, yes, we can attitude here? Because this isn't PR this time. This is the real deal. And you're right, 16, that really shocked people. We elected, the majority of the people voted for our first woman president. And the fact that she didn't get to enter the Oval Office after winning the election as stunning, I think, and still stunning as a strong feminist voice, I mean, people listening to this are probably that you're for Bernie and not for one of the women that are running. I mean, how do you? What's your answer to that? I mean, people must say this to you, or women must say this to you, or Naomi. I mean, come on, enough of this. 45 men have been president of this country, and maybe we should. One of the things we need to try differently is the majority gender should have a stronger say in this.
Well, it matters to me that Bernie has a lot of really strong women around him. And, if you look at who's out there, so his most powerful surrogates, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Pramila Jayapal, Nina Turner from the very beginning, of course, and Jane Sanders as well. And inside the campaign, there are so many strong women, heading up communications, political organizing, and deputy campaign director. I mean, if I wasn't seeing this, I wouldn't be as excited as I am right now. I guess my politics are just a little bit different. Like, I've never been obsessed with sort of representation at the top. I'm not saying it doesn't matter about having a woman president. I would love to see a woman president one day. I think Elizabeth Warren is a very strong candidate. And if she were to win this primary, which it doesn't look like she's going to do, I would campaign like hell for her. But I'm backing the candidate who I feel has the policies that meet our era, that meet the stakes of our moment. And the biggest difference when it comes to climate between Warren and Sanders has to do with what I was talking about before, the internationalist piece. Internationalism is a really key part of my politics, and it's only, it has to do with having covered wars and being immersed in the climate crisis and understanding these are crises that we don't solve just as nation states. There's, Elizabeth Warren talks about economic patriotism being the centerpiece of her Green New Deal. She talks about greening the military. There's no discussion about putting real money on the table to make good on what the U.S. owes to the world. She doesn't have Bernie's history when it comes to opposing foreign intervention. I first talked to Bernie after I published The Shock Doctrine. He called me out of the blue. He said, I'm not even going to try to do a Bernie accent, but he said, I went to the University of Chicago when all those goddamn Chicago boys were there.
Right.
And I watched Milton Friedman and all those guys getting the Chicago boys ready to go to Chile and Argentina and do all that. And he's like, I think we should have a town hall meeting in Burlington, Vermont, and we'll tell people about it. And he said, I think we could get 500 people to come out for that.
Did you
we
go?
didn't. We back and forth. We didn't end up doing it. But I look back and I have this email, and it just makes me laugh that he really thought we could pull 500 people. That was going to be the big victory.
Right.
And now here he is, speaking to 25,000 people in Queens.
Right.
But that's the kind of thing that makes me trust Bernie, because I feel like it's that, and it's the movement piece of it, that we are up against such fierce powers that are going to try to stop whatever we try to do, even the most incremental changes. They will come down like a ton of bricks, right? And it's that steadfastness, it's that rootedness, right? I mean, you need deep roots when you are in a storm. It's something else I've noticed covering disasters. And Bernie has those roots, and I trust that. And I also do feel Bernie listens. He has this reputation for being the guy who hasn't changed his views in 40 years. But the truth is, it's not true. He's changed on Israel-Palestine. He's evolved to really grasp more and more the extent of the climate crisis. He's moved on mass incarceration and criminal justice, on gun violence.
Right.
And I notice that it's often because of women close to him who he does listen to. I think a lot of really gifted politicians have the knack of making people feel heard even when they're not being listened to. People feel heard. And Bernie actually has the opposite, which is that he makes people feel unheard even when he is listening.
Right.
Because he sort of gets it right away, and he's like, yeah, got it, moving on.
Okay, I got it. Yeah. It's like,
but he does. He evolves. But the core values, the core principles haven't shifted, and they've animated his life, and that really matters. And then the other piece of it is just we need a movement to win this, and this campaign is like nothing we've seen before because they really are organizing as they go.
It's so exciting to see here. The level of the volunteers and the commitment, and it's freezing cold here. And it's I mean, as a Canadian, you would probably call this
nothing.
Balmy weather. But
it's called winter, guys. Get over it.
But everybody out there. I mean, it's just, we've gone to the smallest towns and there's not enough room, and there's always an overflow crowd that we have to go talk to because we don't want them. They're standing out in the cold. There's
that organizing and these amazing conversations that people are having. You know, when I was in New Hampshire, I spoke to a group of canvassers, and I was, helping them, hone the messaging at the doorstep, as what we do when we talk to canvassers before they go out. Remember to say this, remember to say that, But this guy came up to me afterwards and he said, what I find is the most important thing is actually just to listen. Give people a space to share their stories. Everybody wants to share. Everybody has a story to tell. And once we do that, then we can talk about the policies. And I just thought that was so beautiful. And that is really what is revolutionary about this, is it's bringing people out of their isolation and this thing that you thought you had to carry on your own, that you thought was because you had failed, because you were, didn't work hard enough or hadn't organized enough or somehow are deficient, is actually part of a systemic crisis. And you have all of this company, and there are systemic solutions that in response to it. So there's that kind of organizing, which is almost like consciousness raising, it's not like getting out the vote, right? And then there's like supporting actual strikes all along the way, right? And bringing attention and resources to the LA teachers who are striking to be able to serve their communities and their students better. So the organizing is multi-layered, right? It's basic political education, right? It is that on the ground organizing to get out the vote, and it's also strengthening, rebuilding. The organizers that are trying to rebuild after attacks on membership-based organizations after so many years, right? This is so significant to the labor movement, I think, and groups like the Sunrise Movement who are trying to have a membership-based youth organization across the country and are doing such incredible organizing, or the Dream Defenders doing the same for racial justice and against police violence. This is these are the forces that we will need if we get a progressive in office, and that's what I find very exciting as well.
We're out of time here. Just tell me one more time before you leave that it's not too late, and I'm referring specifically to climate, because I have just felt that we have totally screwed ourselves. And it's not just the number of species that we've lost now that are gone forever, the ice that has melted that's gone, at least for now, maybe forever. I don't think I'm alone in this sense of, we don't want to say it out loud because we think saying it out loud, then it happens. It is happening. But, we should have listened to you and Bill McKibben and everybody else 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And when you all said that we can't get above 350 parts per million, the carbon in the atmosphere, or because we won't be able to fix it. We won't be able to regenerate it. What are we at now? 415 parts per million? I'm just beside myself with this. It's like, now we can't turn it back. We went past the marker. Before I leave, I just need you to lift my spirit, and not false hope. I'm not asking you to help me feel better. Mm-hmm. I want to hear that, which is going to take us and save us. Because I've never believed that we're going to kill the planet. The planet will kill us long before It's
it won't be intentional. It'll just shake us off.
Well,
it's not malicious.
Yes,
the Earth's not a terrorist. We're the ones with the problem.
Yes, it will just go. Okay, we don't need this anymore, and
don't blame her. It's not her fault. She's just trying to protect herself.
Exactly. That's my point. So help me out here.
Look, we are going to be living on a different Earth. You know, Bill McKibben published a book a few years back called Earth. They changed the spelling of it because it really is a different planet that we've created. That those parts per million do matter, and we cannot. So here's what we can do. We can do everything possible to keep warming levels below that threshold after which we pass all kinds of tipping points where unfathomable number of lives hang in the balance, right? Which is why I feel like we can't give in to that feeling, that sort of doomism, that sort of Jonathan Franzen in the New Yorker going like, oh gosh, all you activists with your activism stuff. And, don't you realize it's too late? Let's all just kind of go upstate and plant our gardens. And
that's what he said in the New Yorker a few months ago.
He did.
He said, let's stop spending our money on building bullet trains or something that would be more environmentally sound. And we should be spending our federal tax dollars moving people to higher ground, building the seawalls, these things that, we're
going to have to do a lot. I said earlier that the space for humanity is contracting, but this is a big planet, and it is possible for us to live well and treat each other well within a habitable space for humanity if we radically lower emissions and we begin to rapidly draw down carbon from the atmosphere, right? So one of the things that I find most exciting about the Green New Deal is looking at the old New Deal and looking at the parts of it that we really need to learn from. And there are big warnings in there, and there are also sources of big inspiration. And we know about the warnings that African-American workers were left out, who worked in agriculture, domestic workers were left out. Many of the programs discriminated wildly against African-Americans and Mexicans, particularly in the South. But the New Deal also did some absolutely incredible things, and we still are using the infrastructure in our libraries and schools and reservoirs and hundreds of public parks and state parks. One of the program that I think is maybe most relevant to us is the Civilian Conservation Corps, which FDR launched immediately after taking office because he had started it in New York State when he was governor. He'd started something similar, where it's always worth remembering that in the 1930s there was this epic financial crisis, obviously the Great Depression, and that was the primary thing that the New Deal was trying to address. But there was also the greatest ecological crisis the U.S. had ever experienced, which was the Dust Bowl. And there was a huge crisis of soil erosion and deforestation. So FDR launched the Civilian Conservation Corps, which sent out a couple million young men into...
My dad was one of them.
Was he really?
Yes.
See, okay. Now I know they're telling us we're out of time, but see, now we've just hit on like one of my favorite topics. I want to hear all about it.
Go ahead.
They sent these young men out and they planted 2.3 billion trees, which is more than half the trees ever planted in the United States. And that's what we can do. And if we planted... if we planted 2.3 billion trees, that would draw a whole lot of carbon down from the atmosphere. It's not instead of getting off of fossil fuels. We also have to do that. But if we did both of those and we were part of inspiring the rest of the world to do the same, then we are creating habitat. If we do it right, if we have indigenous communities leading this, and we're not just planting tree plantations, but actually kind of rewilding the world, we're rebuilding habitat for animals. So it's going to be a different world. It does not have to suck. I think that Hollywood has given us a very sort of linear idea of the future, which is like it's either, I don't know, kind of like we think about the future. It's either just us continuing in, without change, or it's some version of apocalyptic breakdown, cannibalism, us only way worse, right?
Yeah.
And writers like Kim Stanley Robinson and others, try to give us images of the world that are not telling us that everything's going to be okay. That are telling us that it's going to be rocky and we are going to face losses. But there can be ways of organizing ourselves as humans within that rocky future that are actually better than the present. And I don't know. So it's not like a rah, we can do this. It's not. It's we have fucked up hugely. We should be, in my opinion, at least as afraid of things getting meaner, more hyper-individualist, more racist, more supremacist, more patriarchal, if we do not change our system and the underlying values. We should be as afraid of that as we are afraid of storms and droughts and so on. Mm-hmm. So, when we talk about not me, us, and this fundamental shift of like whether or not we're going to say everybody has a right to healthcare, everybody has a right to housing, we're going to welcome refugees, we are not going to separate families, we are going to end mass incarceration. I mean, these are expressions of values that will determine whether or not we face these crises with our humanity, or whether or not we become our worst nightmares. That's what's on the line here. I mean, like Rosie Perfect left the station. Like, we are looking at a rocky future. This is why it is such a goddamn joke when people call Bernie Sanders radical. The future is radical. The future is radical. We have locked in a radical future. Yeah. And the question is, are we going to take some control over that radical so that we are able to navigate that in ways that preserves much of the living systems of our planet and allows us to treat each other well, or are we just going to let it burn on its own? But there is no future that looks like the present.
I believe millions of people are ready and waiting right now to take that stand. I think we're going to see it. We're going to see it this year. I think enough people do know what you just said, what the options are. And there is no perfect planet that may not be in our lifetime, but somehow, look, if I can get over it, it's like I just will not. I can't sink into that despair, and I've met and seen enough people on this campaign trail to actually believe that this is going to happen. And people listening to this should really think about getting on board the train.
Oh, yes.
Because yes, we're going to vote for Bernie, but Bernie will be the first to tell you he's not the conductor of the train. We're all the conductors of this train. The train only moves through our power, not through one individual, not through one, leader. But the forces against us here are profound. In Trump's rally in New Jersey this week, where they had the helicopter shot of people in this large parking lot full of humans waiting. Some of them waited for over 24 hours to get into the rally. They couldn't fit everybody into this place. It was it really should remind everybody that whatever minute, hour, day you have in this year of 2020 to get involved, to do something, you don't want to see what the picture is going to look like if it happens again. And it can happen again, Trump. It will be. I don't think, do we have 4 more years to just not only do nothing, but actually help make it worse?
We don't have 4 more years.
No.
I mean, we didn't have these 4 years.
We didn't have these 4 years.
And we most certainly don't have another 4 years. And the other thing I think people really need to understand is that 4 more years of Trump are not just these 4 years extended. A second term is different than the first term. And that really hit me after Modi was reelected in India. And the first thing he did was, go after Kashmir turn off the internet, put the millions of people under lockdown, and then he starts stripping Muslims of their citizenship. The sort of pogrom-like violence in Modi's second term has vastly escalated. So the way these guys see a re-election, the kind of license that empowers them with, is truly terrifying. So anybody telling themselves a story of like, well, it wasn't as bad as we thought, or something like that, we can just have 4 more years. It's not going to be the same 4 years. It would be different.
On that note,
get out of your house, step away from Twitter. If you feel despair, get in rooms full of other people. Nobody can handle this all on their own. Like I was on book tour in the fall. I was talking to people about the climate crisis. It was really hard, Michael. Like I was feeling like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can just make people feel hopeful about this crisis, just me and my book. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel completely different when I'm out on the campaign trail because what this moment is about is like, this is a movement. Nobody's carrying this on their own, right? We're carrying this together, and that makes everything possible. So get out there.
Get out there. We'll be there with you. Tell us where you're at. We'll come to where you're at. Come to us. Whatever it is, but together, millions of us. I do believe can make this happen, but it has to happen now. We're not going to get a second chance on this. So everybody, I know you're busy. I know it's the struggle every day, every week. You get home and maybe you get a half hour with the kids because you're having to work so hard to get by. But there's no choice. I don't know what else to say. I'm sorry. I'm really honored that you came on my podcast here today, Naomi. And I'm sorry. I have to thank Canada for giving us Margaret Atwood and you and other Canadians. And thank God for your parents, too, for having the courage, for your dad to say, as Muhammad Ali said, no Vietnamese ever tried to kill me. Your dad made a decision to say, I'm not going to kill people, and so I have to leave. Such a courageous move that I'm certain wasn't easy. I'm so grateful for your existence on this planet, and I think you're going to and are one of the people that are going to help save us. So, but I say that knowing that we are only going to do this if we all save ourselves. And do not think that Michael Moore or Naomi Klein or Bernie Sanders and we're going to take care of all this for you. That's not how it's going to work. It's going to require everybody, and we'll do whatever we can to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's such a pleasure, privilege, all the P's. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll talk to everybody in a few days here. Talk to you.